Now, in all honesty, one of the more enjoyable times in recent Star Wars history was actually right after The Force Awakens came out. Because even though, sure, maybe not all fans initially loved or enjoyed that movie, and I do think less like it now in hindsight, but I think it still left most of us with hope for the future, or at the very least we were focused on theorizing about where the story was headed and who these characters would turn out to be, figuring there was some type of grand plan in place for the trilogy. In fact, some fans believed in a grand plan so much they looked for meaning and clues in virtually everything, and even the smallest of details from Episode 7 or any of the material attached to it, somehow believing there was intent behind nearly every decision they'd made in the film. A lot of us even thought when all was said and done, we'd be left with this beautiful, intricately weaved tapestry of a story that would answer not only all the questions raised from that first film in the sequel trilogy, but blend right into the previous trilogies, enhancing the whole saga. We never really considered the possibility there might be little to no plan going into it, that the first film, The Force Awakens, would just throw a bunch of questions and mysteries out there that they had no idea how they'd eventually answer, or that maybe fans would come up with better ideas than what we'd ultimately get. And one fan theory a lot of people seem to like and get behind was the idea that Rey would turn out to be a Kenobi, or more specifically, that she'd turn out to somehow be the granddaughter of Obi-Wan Kenobi, that at some point during his exile on Tatooine, he had, let's just say, met someone special and spent some quality time with them and had a child who would later go on to be one of Rey's parents. However, according to Kathleen Kennedy, this was an idea they never even considered, with her saying of it in a recent Vanity Fair article that the bigger issue is talking about Obi-Wan as a master Jedi, and the issue of attachment and selflessness. In order for Obi-Wan to have a child, you are really impacting the rules around the Jedi. What does that mean, if that were explored? And certainly there were a lot of ideas being thrown around, but anything to do with Obi-Wan in that regard was pretty much off the table because it flies in the face of everything George created in the mythology. Okay, so first of all, and I say this unironically and not intending to sound like an ass, but a part of me does want to applaud Kennedy for knowing and saying all this about the Jedi at the very least, for wanting to honor Lucas and these characters like she said she was going to when she took over, and we can debate about how good of a job she's done with all that.
The main thing is to protect these characters, make sure that they still continue to live in the way that you created them, and that the universe of Star Wars continues to grow.
Because perhaps my biggest gripe with her as president of Lucasfilm is that I don't think she's very knowledgeable when it comes to the lore, and that she isn't really all that much of a Star Wars fan. In other words, if she wasn't, president of Lucasfilm and friends with George Lucas, I don't think Star Wars is something that would even be on her radar, much less something she'd be really into. I mean, in articles I've read or interviews I've seen of her, when she gets asked a question like, what does Star Wars mean to you personally, she'll usually give some type of generic answer about how she was in film school at the time it came out and talks about the impact it had on the industry, or how she was impressed by what George Lucas had created. She never seems to actually answer by explaining what she personally likes about Star Wars. And though, to be fair, you don't necessarily need to be the most knowledgeable Star Wars fan in the world to run Lucasfilm, as long as you surround yourself with those who are knowledgeable and tend to defer to them when it comes to story ideas, it no doubt would have helped or would help for her to know and understand the lore of Star Wars heading into the creation of the sequel trilogy, and also have or use a little bit of foresight to realize how decisions made in regards to those films would ripple out and through the rest of the lore and impact future stories and previous stories, not to mention how they'd impact the fan base. For example, though again I do credit her for understanding that under normal circumstances a Jedi wouldn't have children, that it would go against the no attachment rule or the Jedi Code, she should keep in mind here that Obi-Wan hasn't or didn't live the standard sort of Jedi life, that he essentially spent 20 years alone in the desert, 20 long, lonely years where there were no doubt times he questioned everything, where the guilt and regret got the best of him and maybe he wanted to give up. Heck, isn't that even kind of what the point of the upcoming Kenobi series is, or what it's going to be all about? Aren't we going to find Kenobi broken and full of doubt and regret? And I'm not saying he's going to be full Luke in The Last Jedi kind of broken, or at least I hope he isn't, but certainly we'd understand that after 10 years, again alone in the desert, if he met the right person, he'd consider breaking all his Jedi vows and walking away from everything just to be happy, or maybe he'd do it for just one night. And though I know Kennedy once forgot about or somehow didn't know about the expanded universe, There is a book from it simply called Kenobi, where he is somewhat tempted and interested in a woman. Not to mention, if she knew the lore better, and this time it comes from the official Lucas canon, she'd know that Obi-Wan was indeed in love before, that he himself said he would have left the Jedi Order had Satine only asked him.
Satine, this is hardly the time or place for... All right. Had you said the word, I would have left the Jedi Order.
In other words, though, yes, many see Kenobi as sort of the ideal or perfect Jedi, and you maybe don't want to tamper with that too much, I think most would understand that he's not infallible and that maybe they even like the idea of him having a child at some point. Again, this was a rather popular theory after The Force Awakens came out. And had they done this, they could have maybe gone one of two ways with that story. It could have been either where he never knew, while alive at least, that he had a child, that it's only something he learned about after he died and became a Force ghost, or it could be he knew about the child or learned whoever he'd fallen for was going to have one, and in the end he makes the hard decision, the Jedi decision, to give up his child to keep watching Luke. Whichever way they wanted to go with it, that child could have then obviously gone on to have a child of their own or a daughter named Rey, and then she should have gone on to eventually been trained by Luke, completing the circle of Obi-Wan having once trained two Skywalkers, Anakin and Luke, and now Luke training a Kenobi.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
It also means Obi-Wan's commitment to watching Luke, assuming the instance where he knew he was going to have a child, also comes full circle because now he has somewhere or someone to send his lost and wayward granddaughter to. They could have also had it then where Kenobi, as a Force ghost, was the one guiding Rey to Luke, using the Skywalker saber to do it, a saber he kept in his possession for many long years, and once handed to Luke, and now she's going to hand it to him, and, well, you get the connections.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
We even hear Obi-Wan say, "These are your first steps" to Rey in that film, which many already looked at, back in the day anyway, as evidence of her being a Kenobi. And even things like her using a mind trick on a stormtrooper and being able to defeat Kylo Ren by simply closing her eyes and letting the Force in could have been attributed to Obi-Wan somehow helping her, even though yes, Obi-Wan himself once said he couldn't interfere with such things.
If you choose to face Vader, you will do it alone. I cannot interfere.
But perhaps that could be because the more he interacts with the physical world and the more Force ghosts show up in general, the weaker their connection becomes to the living Force and the more they kind of fade away until they're entirely gone. And this happens pretty quickly, which then of course helps answer the Force ghost dilemma, why they don't do more or at least show up to guide the living more often. It could also meant Obi-Wan's last act was both to help his granddaughter by showing her a path to take, if you will, and to help Luke once more, help him like he needed help once upon a time when he had also lost his way. And had they gone this route with Rey, again, if they'd had the foresight and really looked at and understood all the lore as well as the bigger story they were crafting, the upcoming Kenobi series could have tied into all this. It could have tied into the sequel trilogy and shown and been partly about this woman Obi-Wan would come to love, the woman he contemplates giving up his duty as a Jedi for. And do keep in mind the idea to do a story about Kenobi has been in place for a while now, though the original idea was to make it a film back when the anthology films were still a thing. Later, of course, the idea became to make it a Disney Plus series, which is what we're getting now, obviously. But my point is, they've known for a while they wanted to do something with Kenobi, and they could have easily tied it into the sequels, again, with just a little bit of foresight. And then not only could we end up with something attached to the bigger picture, to the bigger saga of Star Wars, but we could have ended up with something that really is just an introspect about Kenobi and who he is and what's going on in his life at this point in time. Even though recently Deborah Chow, the director of the upcoming series, said this will be a character-driven story like Joker and Logan, which is a pretty bold statement to make, and I'm not sure if that fills me with hope or dread, or a little bit of both. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think. Would you have liked to have seen Rey end up the granddaughter of Kenobi? Keeping in mind, if you're someone who doesn't like the sequels, that would have changed the entire story, and it would have implied they had a plan all along. Or were you never just a fan of this theory in the first place? Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below. Let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.